Coming up, the Sky News Daily with me, Niall Paterson. Get yourselves up to date on one story in the news in around 20 minutes. Today, the Transport Secretary Louise Haigh has resigned after she admitted to pleading guilty to which offence? Stay there and you'll find out.
The Transport Secretary says she remains committed to Labour's political project as she steps down from the Cabinet.
Now, you might have seen the breaking news, but if you missed it, Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary, has become the first minister to resign from Sir Keir Starmer's government. Our political correspondent Rob Powell and political reporter Alexandra Rogers got the scoop that caused that resignation, and they join me in our Westminster studio. Good to see you both. Rob, let's start with the basics. What on earth is going on?
What's happened is that Louise Haigh has resigned and she's no longer the Transport Secretary. What caused that, at its core, isn't really in dispute. It's that 6 months before she became a Labour MP, while she was a Labour candidate campaigning in Sheffield Heeley, she was convicted of an offence that she turned up at Camberwell Green Magistrates Court on the 3rd of November 2014, and she pleaded guilty to that offence. Now, there is a lot of unknowns and a lot of fuzziness around that and a lot of conflicting accounts about who knew what and what actually happened. But at its core, that is what this story is, and that is what has led to her resignation.
So the story is basically about a false report of a lost or stolen mobile phone that she made to her former employer, Aviva. Now, Louise Haigh is saying that she was mugged on a night out. She thought the phone was stolen, but subsequently realised that it wasn't. Now, she admits that she didn't raise it immediately with her employer, and it all became a bit suspicious, and she was forced to leave her role from Aviva. Now, she's saying it's all an honest mistake, but there's still questions over that. You know, why plead guilty to an offence? Why is any coming out now? And I think we can see from Keir Starmer's response, there's suggestions that he knew. There's still questions over how much he knew, but he knew elements of this story. And the response is short. The response says, thank you for your time in government. See you later.
Yeah, it certainly does. Although he does stick that line in, I know you still have a huge contribution to make in future, which does leave the cabinet door slightly ajar. But Rob, I mean, I'm looking at Louise Haigh's letter, and it doesn't contain any mention of the criminal offence nor the guilty plea. It just contains a reference to the mugging.
And I think the three words that are really interesting in that resignation letter are the first three in the main body of text, as you know. So she is saying that Keir Starmer knew about this.
OK, let's just be clear here. She refers to, in this letter, the mugging. She doesn't refer to the offence, and she says, you know. So what is it that she is saying that Keir Starmer knew, and what's Downing Street saying that Keir Starmer knew?
All of that is unfortunately quite unclear. We've just had the lobby briefing, and it was probably the tensest one I've ever been to, actually. A lot of very long pauses when journalists were asking questions to the Prime Minister's spokesperson. He came armed with one line, essentially, which he read out over and over again to many of the questions. There must have been a couple of dozen, ultimately, which was following further information emerging, the Prime Minister accepted her resignation. Now, we tried what that new information was.
No answer.
Following further information again. We tried the basic question, which really lies in terms of the Keir Starmer judgment question at the heart of this. Did Keir Starmer know that she had a conviction when he appointed her to cabinet earlier this year? And we got no answer to that. So the position as we stand at time of recording is that Downing Street appears unable to say whether he knew about this. Now, I think from reading into what he said, and I think from other conversations, my takeaway would be that he knew something, but potentially not everything. And the bit that he didn't know that he learnt from us is the reason why she resigned, because they insist that she resigned on her own volition rather than being pushed. I think the other part here that's crucial, though, as well, is often when you get a quick resignation, the journalistic instinct points towards, and this is what other reporters sat in lobby this morning were asking, is, well, is there more to come?
Is there?
Well, I think what we'd say on that is that what put us onto this story and what we were preparing to report yesterday is that we have separate sources, credible sources, making the allegation that the reason why this phone was reported stolen was for Louise Haigh's own personal benefit.
Just be really clear. When you say for personal benefit, you are suggesting that your sources are claiming that she intended to permanently deprive her employer of that phone.
That there was intention here that she was trying to benefit from doing this. That is the story that we were about to publish at 6 p.m. yesterday. And it's ultimately what we did publish, but it obviously got swamped a little bit in the actual admission from Louise Haigh. And, I think that's important in this because Louise Haigh has set out her position here, but we have people that are saying very different things about those circumstances.
Well, I can read the key line as well as suggesting that the Prime Minister was aware at least of the mugging that took place back in 2013. She concludes the first paragraph, "I should have immediately informed my employer, and not doing so straight away was a mistake." If it turns out that that is not correct, Louise Haigh might be in even more trouble, frankly.
I think that's one of the key questions raised is why was this not raised with Aviva straight away? Why was there time? Why did she sit on this? I think that's one of the key questions that emerges from her statement.
There are lots of unanswered questions about that initial statement. How you can basically think you had a work phone stolen and then find it days later in a drawer. The statement also appears to have slightly altered between her resignation letter and her statement last night, where she says the original work device was switched on, triggered the police attention, whereas the resignation letter seems to suggest that the driving force came from Aviva. There is woolliness around this. And I think that is the danger here, because where there is sort of woolliness, there is ample opportunity for kind of journalistic inquiry here. And bluntly, stories like this become a feeding frenzy, and things often can come out that can challenge the statement that they've put out. And that's when it gets really difficult for the government more broadly if they are standing by the person in question.
But Alex, obviously there's an awful lot more to dig into, but first things first, we've got a replacement for Transport Secretary, don't we?
Yeah. Heidi Alexander. Heidi Alexander was Deputy Mayor of Transport under Sadiq Khan. So she was in charge of Transport for London, TfL. So people will say she has good experience of running a very effective transport network in the capital. But I think it's quite interesting. She's a very different character to Louise Haigh. Louise Haigh has become known for spearheading quite a reformist agenda with bringing buses back into public control, the same with the railways. There's questions over whether Heidi Alexander will take quite a bold approach and, whether she will be as close to the unions as Louise Haigh maybe was. So this is an interesting appointment, and there's sort of suggestions maybe that Heidi was actually the chosen favourite for the role initially, but that Sue Gray, when she was in power, who has links to...
Remind us who Sue Gray was, because she was only there for 5 minutes. Come on.
Sue Gray, famously the author of the Partygate report that contributed to Boris Johnson's downfall, who was made, controversially, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, loses a power struggle within Number 10 and she's out, and Morgan McSweeney is back in. So I think we can possibly read that Heidi Alexander is maybe Morgan's pick for the job.
But Rob, remind us, for those who don't know Louise Haigh's backstory in Parliament, they may only know her from one distinguishing feature, the colour of her hair as she marched up Downing Street. Just tell us a little bit more about her.
I think if people know of her, the thing they may have seen more recently, where she also was making headlines, was when actually our colleague Paul Kelso at Sky News revealed a story that comments she made about boycotting P&O ferries over their mass sacking of workers, about how that led to an investment deal of £1 billion being temporarily shelved on the eve of a big investment summit. Now, that was salvaged, that got back on track, but it did lead to a public rebuke for Louise Haigh from Sir Keir Starmer, saying those are not the government's words, not the government's view. So she became the first cabinet minister to be publicly rebuked by the Prime Minister, and she's now become the first cabinet minister to walk. So there is previous here, there is tension, and I think that is the sort of intriguing political backdrop that this story lands into, and is possibly one of the reasons why she has gone so quickly. So in terms of, I think, where she sat within the cabinet, she was someone that I don't think was of the sort of hard socialist left. She's not sort of in the Diane Abbott grouping of people, although she did vote for Jeremy Corbyn, support Jeremy Corbyn for leader, something I think she then said she went on to regret. But she was seen as being, I think, from the soft left. And within the Starmer cabinet, I think those are kind of rare appointments. So I think what this does to the tilt of the cabinet is really interesting.
I wonder whether this acts as a bit of a warning shot to other cabinet ministers who might not be, fully aligned ideologically with Morgan McSweeney, the power behind the throne. I wonder whether they're sort of thinking, OK, I better watch what I'm doing.
But look, let's rewind just a second. How did you get onto this story in the first place, Rob?
So it came, as many stories do, from a tip-off, from someone getting in contact and making basically an allegation around the circumstances in which Louise Haigh left her job at Aviva. Now, we can't run stuff based on one source, so there was a process there, and I was able to track down second source. And then from there, we were both able to essentially find further sources to stand up the other elements of the story. And then it is essentially a judgment call around whether we feel we have the information we need from credible enough sources, from essentially different sort of parts of the information sphere where journalists go hunting around for tidbits, to feel like we are confident enough in what we are saying to go to Louise Haigh's team about that. We felt we did, and we were preparing to publish this story at about 6 p.m. yesterday, and about 3 minutes to 6, the response came through from Louise Haigh setting out the circumstances as she sees them, and we ended up doing it basically an hour later with that. The one thing we weren't able to get hold of, though, was the precise details of the conviction. I spent an enjoyable Monday going around several magistrates' courts in London, Westminster Magistrates, City of London Magistrates, Croydon Magistrates, Lavender Hill Magistrates' Court, emptying my bag and getting searched at each one, basically to try and find the listing and find the public record of this. You were talking about a court that no longer exists. Camberwell Green Magistrates Court was in the swathes of courts that was shut down, that one in 2017. So, the building's still there. It's fallen into disrepair, but the record didn't exist. It may well still be, and I'm still waiting for potentially an email to drop in from the Magistrates Court listing office confirming what actually happened. But as such, that's not what we had, but we were sure that there was a conviction.
Please do not take this as me playing devil's advocate, but isn't this a really low bar for a senior cabinet resignation? That an offence, an incident that Louise Haigh implies that Sir Keir Starmer knew something about, which happened before she came into Parliament, years later, she ends up getting chucked out because of it.
I think there's definitely a case to be made that this conviction is spent. It was a very long time ago. People make mistakes. People should be allowed to move on. I think the issue is almost around comms here. Why wasn't this disclosed earlier? There was an opportunity to make this less of a story.
When?
When she was in the shadow cabinet in a less prominent role, there could have been a way to get this out where she apologised for it and it didn't become such a big deal. I think what makes it difficult is she's now in a position of trust as a cabinet minister. It's been concealed up until this time. It just doesn't look very transparent. And when Keir Starmer has put so much stock in being an open, transparent man of integrity, you kind of expect different from him, I think.
I think there's a degree of political naivety that you can keep a skeleton this size in your closet when you're a cabinet minister. Mm-hmm.
Particularly when you were previously, as Louise Haigh was, a special constable.
And shadow policing minister as well. And frequently would talk about rule breaking under previous Tory governments as well.
Particularly around Boris Johnson, yeah. But Alex, I mean, what's been the kind of the parliamentary reaction to all of this? I suspect the Tories are having a field day.
Yeah, the Tories have said it raises serious questions about Keir Starmer's judgment. Why did you put it, as they put it, convicted fraudster in cabinet? So, yeah, and I think they're probably enjoying the kind of hypocrisy element and the double standards that have come out of this as well. I think within Labour there is genuine sadness. I think she was a popular member of the cabinet. She was seen as someone who was actually taking a reformist stance on transport, bringing, bus and railways into public ownership. And I think, for some people, this will be a loss.
But for Sir Keir Starmer, will this be a loss?
There may be some people that aren't completely grieving this. But, that doesn't detract from the fact that it's not good for the government. It's not good for the government to have a cabinet minister in place for getting on 6 months, who has a conviction to her name, and the fact that these questions are now being asked of the Prime Minister in his judgment. He is someone that has talked about during the Partygate period that you cannot be a lawmaker and a lawbreaker, someone that talks about bringing high standards back to government here. And I get that it really does sound like there are mitigating circumstances, but it's very difficult to get past the idea that he clearly knew something about this and still put her in the cabinet. So as much as the sort of Kremlinology of the sort of shifting sands of who's in and who's out is relevant and really interesting, this is not a good news story for the government.
This isn't the first kind of scandal. There's been the freebies row, which has made some of the cabinet ministers look like they're on a massive jolly while, cutting winter fuel payments for most pensioners. It's another bad news story that it isn't reflective of what Labour said they were going to be like during the election campaign.
So do you think, outside the Westminster bubble, do you think people care about this?
I think so. I think it's about honesty in politics, isn't it, really?
Do people think politicians are honest anymore?
Well, maybe
genuinely?
not. I think you're right. I think there is a massive cynicism about politicians and the way that they behave. And, I think that's been in motion for a while. But I think people will have judged Keir Starmer for what he said he was going to be like as Prime Minister. And what's happened here and the lack of honesty and transparency over it does not speak well to that.
I think people aren't, in the weeds of this. But I think, headlines that combine words like Transport Secretary, guilty, fraud.
Former police officer.
I think it's one of those stories that probably lowers the public's view of all politicians. But the reason why that's dangerous for Labour is I think that they're coming into office promising something new, yes, on standards, but I think they're also promising it on how they're going to run the country, how they're going to run public services. Having a dodgy start like this and having a really, really bumpy time makes it more important that they actually deliver on their policies, because I think people can forgive this stuff if they can get a GP appointment, if they feel like they're getting better off. If they don't, and none of that works, and you put that together with the scandal that's bumping on, people think, well, this is just like the previous lot. We'll go somewhere else. It
really ramps up the pressure on them to really perform.
Well, we will see, won't we? Guys, lovely to see you both. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, that's a lot from Rob, Alex and myself on this. But there is another huge story taking place in Westminster today. MPs are, as we are recording, debating whether or not to start the process of legalising assisted dying. So if you want to know much more about that, you can listen back to the daily episode from earlier in the week, or head over to the Electoral Dysfunction feed, where Beth, Harriet and Ruth will be reacting to the vote just as soon as it's done. We'll see you Monday.